initially implied non-trained creature species. It presently incorporates all plants, parasites, and different organic entities which develop or live wild in a space without being presented by humans. Domesticating wild plant and creature species for human advantage has happened ordinarily all around the planet. It has hugely affected the climate, both positively and negatively. Wildlife can be found in all biological systems. Deserts, forests, rainforests, plains, grasslands, and different regions, including the most developed urban destinations, all have particular types of wildlife. Most researchers concur that wildlife around is impacted by human exercises. A nursery is certainly not a characteristic environment. However, it is loaded with wildlife. Why is wildlife important? Wildlife keeps up with balance in environments. Each living thing is associated. Assuming even only one living being becomes compromised or terminated, it has a cascading type of influence on a whole biological system. It disturbs the well-established pecking order, sending shockwaves through the climate. It's additionally essential to realize that dangers to species seldom occur in separation. The things that undermine, say, bumblebees likewise compromise different pollinators. For environments to flourish, all wildlife should be secured. Diversity implies better environments. While talking about wildlife, you'll regularly hear the expression biodiversity. This alludes to the number of species in an environment. Sound biological systems have a ton of variety. For what reason is this significant? Think about plants. A wide assortment of plants implies more prominent efficiency and better well-being. Assuming there are fewer plant species, an infection that influences them spreads quicker and all the more viably. More assortment implies better obstruction. Wildlife gives nutrients to people. All that we eat comes from either a creature or plant initially. While we don't eat as much wildlife as we used to because the food inventory network has become so modern, yields in animals were wildlife at a certain point. Many individuals rely upon wildlife for their food, too. Without an assortment of food sources, our nourishment endures. Ensuring wildlife and regular environments and food security all over the planet. We can likewise further develop nourishment by getting back to all the more wild food sources and enhancing our weight control plans. A lot of medication comes from wildlife. People have consistently gone to nature for medication. Numerous clinical frameworks, like Chinese customary medication, depend on spices, flavors, and then some. However, even drugs wouldn't be the place where they are today without wildlife. Medications like morphine, penicillin, and ibuprofen were obtained from wild plants. Securing wildlife and their natural surroundings means fewer illnesses that influence people. The safeguarding of wildlife and where they reside is significant for human well-being. Research shows that in assorted, insured, and normal regions, there are fewer examples of jungle fever and Lyme infection. 60% of irresistible illnesses, counting COVID-19, come from animals. Closeness to animals builds the dangers for infections evolving and a jumping species. By ensuring territories, people, and wildlife don't need to live so near one another. Individuals rely upon wildlife for their vocations. For some individuals, wildlife is their fundamental kind of revenue. As per the World Economic Forum, $44 trillion, the greater part of the world's GDP, is attached to nature. In the Global South, 1.6 billion individuals rely upon timberlands. All around the world, 3/4 occupations rely upon water. As wildlife and their living spaces recoil, positions are lost. Wildlife has social importance. The effect wildlife has on culture can't be disregarded. The presence of animals and plants has consistently impacted things like strict convictions and food. In numerous native gatherings, sage is an indispensable spice for strict functions. For adherents of Hinduism, elephants and cows are hallowed images. Local dishes made with nearby fixings protect memory and custom while likewise uniting networks. To keep culture and customs alive, it's essential to ensure wildlife. Wildlife is significant for the economy. Wildlife preservation regions and safeguarded regular living spaces draw in guests from everywhere in the world. Many spots rely upon wildlife for the travel industry, which makes up more than 10% of the world's GDP. Nations like Brazil, Australia, Kenya, and more are particularly subject to the travel industry. Without wildlife, the economy of numerous nations would endure essentially. Securing wildlife creates more positions. Talking about the economy, wildlife protection likewise creates more positions. For instance, a major preservation and reasonable administration project in Honduras made north of 8,000 positions and raised local area pay levels by more than 300%. As indicated by research from Heidi Peltier, an exploration teacher and master in work in the U.S. economy, protection and park improvement make a larger number of positions than oil and gas altogether. The formation of IGRINA positions prompts a more feasible and useful economy. Being around wildlife and nature is great for emotional wellness. There's a worldwide psychological wellness emergency. Proof shows that nature can help. Individuals who live near indigenous habitats and wildlife are viewed as more dynamic, genuinely amazing, and better. In one task in the UK, volunteers with poor emotional wellness went to a park in nature strolls and protection work. Following 12 weeks, they revealed feeling much improved. To ensure our emotional wellness, we want to secure wildlife and the environments they live in. What are the benefits of wildlife? Wildlife gives many advantages to nature and human beings as well. They give food, shelter, wood, and many other resources for human life. They also help in reducing global warming by managing greenhouse gas. What is the largest forest in the world? The Amazon is undoubtedly one of the largest forests and wildlife in the world. It is not only one of the biggest forests, but also home to various species that are currently living on our Earth. Where is Amazon forest? The Amazon forest is the largest and spreads across 8 developing countries, including Brazil, Bolivia, Peru, Ecuador, Colombia, Venezuela, Guyana, and Suriname. Is also a domestic asset that not only helps to maintain the ecological balance, but also benefits from financial, recreational, and aesthetic points of perspective. There was a time when the number of wild animals was quite large when human interference was minimum and there was no issue with their safety or conservation. But with the development of farming, settlement, industrial, and other development activities, and primarily due to man's greed, the number of wild animals gradually decreased and decreased. As a consequence, several animal species have become extinct and several are on the brink of being so. The Wildlife Conservation Essay is an insight into the requirements of conserving wildlife globally. While the world's nations must be very specific in terms of wildlife conservation, the amount of wildlife is diminishing day by day. The World Wildlife Fund is a global organization that does a praiseworthy job of encouraging wildlife protection. National agencies are also involved in wildlife conservation. Wildlife tourism is basically the viewing of wild animals in their natural habitats. Tourism affects the ecosystem of wildlife both positively and negatively. Tourism can lead to interference and destruction of the wildlife ecosystem, leading to decrease in the population of the animals and degradation of their habitats. Tourists will interfere with the welfare of the wild animals through their interactions with the animals. The roads and paths that offer access to the wild animals also lead to destruction of the natural habitat of the wild animals. Tourism can also have numerous positive effects on wildlife. Due to the huge incomes that tourism generates, authorities and local communities will aim at preserving the natural habitat of the animals for continued gains in the future. Part of the money earned from tourism can be used for conservation of endangered species and safeguarding the habitat of the wild animals through fencing. Tourism is known to finance conservation efforts of wildlife. Opponents of the argument that tourism negatively affects wildlife claim that tourism in fact promotes conservation efforts of wildlife and their habitat through provision of financial aid. They argue that part of the revenue obtained from tourism is channeled back to conservation efforts of the wildlife, like conservation of endangered species. They also argue that local communities and authorities are dedicated to conserving wildlife primarily because of tourism, as most of them earn their living through tourism-related activities. Rebuttal to the argument that tourism finances conservation effort of wildlife and their habitats. Tourism leads to destruction and interference of the wildlife's habitat. In places with wildlife that attracts tourists, part of the wildlife's habitat is cleared in order to pave way for construction of amenities that meet the needs of tourists, like resorts. Green and Higginbottom 2001, page 37. Tourists may engage in off-road driving and walking through wildlife habitat, which leads to trampling of vegetation and death of small living creatures. Tourism leads to disturbance of normal activities of wildlife. Tourism disrupts the feeding and breeding patterns of wildlife. Tourists move too close to animals with the aim of viewing and taking photographs. The animals become aware of the presence of humans and cannot continue with their routine activities. A study in Mexico revealed a decrease in breeding of brown pelicans by 52 to 100% in areas frequented by tourists compared to areas not visited by tourists. Tourists disrupt the bonding between parent and offspring. In Canada, female harp seals' attendance to their pups reduced when tourists were present. Tourism activities create awareness on conservation efforts of endangered species. Opponents of the argument that tourism negatively affects wildlife claim that tourism creates awareness on conservation of endangered species. Some tourists engage in studying of the ecosystem and create awareness to raise funds for various projects aimed at conservation of the ecosystem. Rebuttal to the argument that tourism creates awareness on conservation efforts of endangered species. Tourism activities may lead to increased vulnerability of some species to predators. Viewing of certain species of wildlife may expose them to predators, leading to a decrease in their population. Certain tourism activities may scare away wildlife from their habitat. In Kenya, increased observation of cheetahs drives them away from their habitat into community farms. Tourism increases cases of poaching and game hunting. Poachers masquerading as tourists gain access to wildlife that have body parts with high monetary value, like elephant tusks. Controlling poaching becomes difficult and expensive. Green and Higginbottom 2001, page 23. Tourists also contribute to decreased population of wildlife through activities like game hunting and sport fishing. The effects can be severe without proper regulation of these activities. The growing practice of ecotourism offers great benefits to wildlife. Opponents of the argument that tourism negatively affects wildlife claim that with the increase in the practice of ecotourism, greater care is taken to educate tourists of the need for preserving wildlife and their habitat. Rebuttal of the argument that ecotourism offers benefits to wildlife. Tourism activities like noise and feeding of wildlife affects behavior and welfare of wildlife. In the Galapagos Islands, artificial feeding led to disruption of breeding patterns of iguanas. Noise generated by motor boats and engines of motor vehicles as tourists move closer to the animals tend to disturb feeding and drinking patterns of wildlife. Newsom and Moore 2005, page 75. Tourism leads to decreased pollution of the wildlife habitat. Tourists lead to pollution of the habitat through littering and noise pollution, which tend to scare wild animals. The use of vehicles and motorboats leads to further pollution of the environment. Burning firewood for providing warmth in resorts leads to environmental pollution. Wildlife tourism is a major source of revenue for countries in Africa and South American countries. However, without proper coordination, it can negatively impact on the wildlife and their habitat. For sustainable tourism, structures should be put in place to minimize the negative effects of tourism to wildlife. Efforts to educate tourists on conserving wildlife should be practiced. Nothing in the world exists in a vacuum, and the ability to find links between different things defines the degree of our maturity. People often forget that the planet is not their property, and it makes them utilize harmful and unethical approaches to wild animals and their rights. In 2015, Kate Clark presented a series of taxidermy sculptures with human faces to illustrate people's unwillingness to recognize themselves as a part of nature. The combination of the brilliant idea and extremely controversial art materials raises a lot of concerns. At the same time, the existence of such projects highlights the need to answer the following question: where do we stand concerning wildlife? If there is one more approach apart from the normalization of violence against animals and supporting hypocritical animal protection initiatives, people have to find it. In modern works devoted to wild nature and its meaning for the human race, some authors tend to criticize the approach to understanding wildlife based on the romanticization of nature as an object. For instance, in her work titled A Shark in the Mind of One Contemplating Wilderness, Tempest Williams argues that wild nature is unique in its beauty when it is in motion. The author is a professional naturalist and environmental activist, and her love for nature prevents her from seeing animals as things that can be studied in any possible ways. Although the preservation of animal remains with the help of taxidermy belongs to the techniques that are commonly used in science, the author claims that there are many hidden threats and ethical issues associated with it. The use of animal bodies can lead to further progression of scientific knowledge in biology and increase common people's levels of zoological literacy. However, apart from its scientific purposes, taxidermy can sometimes be seen as a form of art, and this tendency bothers modern environmental activists. As for the essay by Tempest Williams, one of the author's main arguments relates to people's inability to understand the beauty and complexity of wilderness by staring at dead bodies surrounded by decorations aimed at representing forests, meadows, snow-covered regions, or other places of habitation. In her work, Tempest Williams criticizes her opponent's points by comparing and contrasting her experiences related to wild nature in motion and its said immortal form. The existing links between wilderness, violence, and the transformation of art seem to be used to justify the unnecessary exploitation of natural resources, including animals. After getting acquainted with the projects of Damien Hirst, a contemporary artist from the UK who uses the bodies of animals to challenge common statements about mortality, Tempest Williams gets at the heart of the problem with the understandings of wilderness.